All right, let's start. Yeah, like said, we have a very interesting topic with Charly Salonius-Pasternak from the Nordic West Office, and we will be discussing the scenario planning and facing this current polycrisis, as we can call it. Now, just a couple of technicalities. Yeah. We will be recording this webinar, and the recording will be made available to you and everyone who's registered like afterwards. So don't worry if you need to leave somewhere in the middle. And also, please feel free to send in questions or comments either through chat or in the Q&A section, and we will try and address them as we go. So yeah, we will definitely welcome any questions and comments. Yeah, I think we can then move on straight to the introductions, and I will give the floor to you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Irmeli. Thank you, Irmeli, and welcome, Charly. It's truly a pleasure to have you with us. We know
Very
each
nice
other.
To be here.
Even though we're young men, right? We've known each other at least 20 years from the security policy scene, sort of more widely. I know much about you, and we work together, and we are working together as Inclus and Nordic West Office with multiple clients. But always I'm interested in the guest speaker's background, and the angle to where they are today and what they're doing today. So could you give a little brief about yourself? How did you end up running Nordic West Office?
Sure, yeah. And apologies for the technical snafu up to me, but sure. So about 11 months now, CEO of Nordic West Office. Before that, couple decades at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Though from there I did a few kind of jumps elsewhere too. So I was 2009, 2010 at Finnish Defense Command in their strategic planning group on loan. Then I've been at our Icelandic sister institute, or FIAS, 2019 and 2017. Again, there's something called the Changing Character of War program, now center at Oxford. So I was there studying technology changes, its impact on conflict and information operations, things like that. Perhaps of background interest relevant to the audience, I strongly believe it's useful when you do global analysis to have experienced and looked at different perspectives, which is why I bring up that my first real job, as it were, after university and Finnish National Service was an American technology research company, but I didn't do the research there. After a while, I was responsible for all of the Finnish and Danish companies. So account manager of sorts and content provider. And at the time, Nokia was the second largest company in the world, or most valuable. And a lot of Finnish and Danish companies, from Lego to then Sonora and many others. So I had my first formative work experiences were related exactly to how companies effectively did their business. And it's been useful in research, but it has been nice to kind of remind myself of many of those things in the last 10 or 11 months in how to advise companies and help them in a world that's even less predictable than before.
Well, yeah, even less, and certainly we also sort of see our clients being puzzled with the dynamics of the current world, and the operating environment is constantly shifting to the extent that people are saying that nothing is predictable and the new normal is never normal. What are the sort of biggest challenges you've seen corporations have in navigating the changing scenery?
Well, it's probably a combination. I mean, I'll put one basket is for how long they've in a very serious way, thought about geopolitics, geoeconomics, security policy, all of this impacting their business. I mean, most business leaders obviously have been smart enough to realize this could impact us, but in terms of seriously doing it. Then also maybe, and I'm sure we'll get to this sense of so much is happening. We don't know what's happening. Can we trust our data? Should we use data, and in which ways? So lots of just questions about this is clearly one, because we see a good reason to use information, data, but of course, if you just have too much of it and can't kind of use it in a business or a credible way in business, then that's probably just counterproductive. So lots of discussions around that. And I guess ultimately, I mean, what I've noticed in the last 2-3 months especially is lots of management teams, boards, just wanting to have someone external come and say, tell us about the different possible worlds and let us think about it and kind of manage that discussion. So a very high level set of discussions. And then the next step is working with any number of partners to say, okay, what does this mean concretely for risk management or marketing or communications or whatever it is?
Surely. One way to sort of create some structure around the world is naturally scenario work. And we've seen a lot of corporations trying to create those scenarios themselves, which is sometimes puzzling or hard. And how do you select the sort of drivers and indicators and impacts that you are looking at? And then secondly, how do you then evaluate the significance of those scenarios for your respective industry and company? Those are sort of separate parts of the same process, and you bring in the scenarios with you, and what we've then taken into implications and impact analysis with the Inclus tool. But could you explain a bit about the background and the process, how you develop these scenarios, and what are the main global scenarios, and then maybe a little deep dive to the Polycrisis scenario that we're going to talk about the most today?
Yeah, sure. I'll do that. I will share my screen then. Apologies in advance for the fact that there is so much to cover. I'm going to talk for days about this. So some of this I will rush through quite quickly, or at least I'll have a very broad brush, as it were. Of course, happy to talk about it in detail later. Let's get us going here. All right. So, yeah, Nordic West Office, I'll just say a few words, I guess, about 10 years ago, or founded about 10 years ago, and always doing some sort of scenario work. The kind of crown jewel of the process is, and I'll go through them, are global scenarios, from which we then do both regional as well as some thematic variants. And at the very end, I'll talk about how we're about to renew them. First, I wanted to just start by saying there's so many things happening that what I often, even before getting to scenarios, point out to people that it's useful if you have some buckets into which to put daily news. I won't go through all of these. I'm, again, a separate set of talks, but very broadly, I've identified three, or we've identified three buckets. One is the actors and the relationships between them are changing. So who influences how, where, all of this. The second one is conceptual models of the world are in flux. I'll just give one example of this. Interdependence, which for a few decades was supposed to be almost exclusively good. It was good that we were interdependent. And now, of course, we're seeing in some quarters more and more a sense of, well, it's our people and their people, our data, their data, and a effort to both put literal and figurative walls up. It's much broader, but how we see and understand the world is somewhat changing. On the conflict side, and we'll get to this soon, is are we in a conflict or are we in a war or not? A simple example is Russia, which frequently says it is in a conflict, a war with the West and NATO, where Most of NATO certainly doesn't see it as it being in a war against Russia, and therefore the tools you can use are different. And then the third is objective truths, which of course may sound a little odd, but climate change, the fact that technology impacts our societies, are simply objective truths. If you want to know more about this particular thing, you can pick up this book where I talk about it a little bit more. So how about the future? Well, we do some other scenarios, but most of our scenarios are kind of 2x2. I'll call them shell style, as most will be familiar with that, scenarios. And then the drivers are selected together with a group of, they're done as multi-client projects together with a group of companies. And the ones I'm going to present now, the global scenarios, these versions were originally done in 2022, 2023. They've been updated since, but being that they were done quite well, scenarios, of course, shouldn't go old in a year or two. The drivers you'll see here are how interconnected the world is, so vertically, or how fragmented it is. And this has to do with cooperation, both within groups and states, and then more broadly. And then the other horizontal driver is generally is the world government action driven or market business driven. There are various storylines, and again, this is where it'll be very general, but you'll get the sense of these. One is orderly decoupling. So we see cooperation, but government driven. And here, effectively, some sort of a new Cold War between China and the US. Both do clearly want to de-risk and manage the relationship rather than completely decouple. But then we see Europe carving a somewhat independent path in this world, which has implications for Europe, of course, that are quite different than some of the other scenarios. Then we have a tech boom one. This is maybe the most optimistic, depending on your perspective. So market-driven and lots of cooperation. Geopolitical mega deals, US, China, obviously within Europe, including Russia, solves disputes. AI leads some sort of a productivity revolution, maybe not led by LLMs, but many other uses thereof. But the key is that geopolitical security defense are no longer the key drivers of many decisions. Then we get to sleepwalking, basically kicking the can down the road, where there's more fragmentation and more market-driven. Lots of small crises, but nothing that's actually going to merit strong action, nor cause a global kind of focus on solving an issue, whether or not it's climate change or other things. Here we see, however, especially middle powers, but other actors, also non-governmental actors, gaining increasing amounts of power and influence. Economic growth is generally sluggish, but really, really dependent on the individual countries. And then we get to polycrisis, where we see military escalation. We've seen 3 geopolitical hotspots. So effectively, Europe, Middle East, and China, or Taiwan, Japan, Korea. Here, yes, there is US-Chinese geopolitical competition, but we see the primary tool then unfortunately being military in nature or very strong geoeconomic tools, of which kind of tariffs are only one part. We still see something of cooperation. We'll get into this, but not quite as clearly as in the orderly decoupling, where there's clearly 2 major blocks, US and its allies, Europe carving a somewhat sovereign direction. Polycrisis, unfortunately, doesn't get us there. So here's very broadly the storylines. How about if we dig deeper
Charlie,
into the, yep.
Just a question on this matrix here. Where would you situate us, the world, right now on this map? Where would you pinpoint us?
Interesting. So whenever we do workshops, one of the things we do is we ask people to say, where do they feel we are?
Yeah.
In reality, of course, the real world is a mixture of these, although you can see, but this way, tech boom, very few have put a dot on. Then it depends a little bit on the company, industry, and so on. Somewhere, I'll say, if I had to summarize what we've seen companies now in the last maybe 6 months where they've placed themselves or the world, it's been in a sleepwalking heading into polycrisis, or very much in the polycrisis but borderline between sleepwalking or orderly decoupling. But the direction's definitely, unfortunately, into the kind of government-driven and fragmented nature. That I can say. What I always point out to people is that is useful to think about, at least where there's a starting point. And we have some clients that on a quarterly basis, we meet with them and we talk with them and see what changes have happened. Do they have to draw some strategic conclusions and so on? But that at least initially, it's better to conceive of them as think about and prepare for these, because whether or not you put sleepwalking in a certain likelihood or how close you are to the polycrisis line is probably less meaningful than do you think we're in the top right tech boom corner, in which case I would probably say we should probably do some more work. But yeah, probably some sort of a kind of half moon stretching from sleepwalking through polycrisis and a little orderly decoupling is where most companies have kind of placed themselves.
Yeah, I would say that during Biden's era, US was more on the orderly decoupling side, and then shifting to polycrisis, and Europe was maybe more on the sleepwalking, and also, of course, coming to the polycrisis side. But taken that we are in the polycrisis quadrant here, should we do a deep dive on polycrisis then?
Yes. And here is, so basically, this is a nested scenario of these. We'll not do just time a deep dive, but just so you can see how we approach this. And here we actually have somewhat different drivers, and not unusual. Okay. So the two different driver sets are alliance, NATO, and global cohesion, because of course the United States as the combination most powerful and slightly unpredictable actor at the moment. It has a hub and spoke alliance model in effectively Asia and a different alliance model through NATO and Europe. But is this cohesion high or is it low? And then on the vertical axis, horizontal axis, the nature of the conflict, because it really honestly does matter. Are we in a global World War III, someone has used nuclear weapons type of world? Or are we in a world where there's regional conflicts and wars, hybrid operations, but these conflicts have not merged yet into one global war? It makes huge differences for supply chain and general risk management and planning. So that's why we've split these in this way. Very briefly, top right, so high alliance cohesion, global World War III. Well, the alliance says or alliance holds. NATO remains relevant. The allies collaborate across the globe. So, NATO, Japan, Korea, etc. Then if alliance cohesion is high, but it's more regional and hybrid, we can see, for instance, most European allies supporting US and its allies in Asia Pacific, but only in very specific ways. The US has made clear they really do not want individual European Navy ships in the Pacific. rather take care of Europe and help maybe on intelligence, help on some sort of ISR space capabilities and things like that. NATO's deterrence via Russia holds, again, because we're talking about this quadrant. And some countries support the US in the Middle East. Then on the low side, we see effectively transaction islands. So absolutely, US and Europe focus on their own regions, key or neighborhoods. Sanctions lose effectiveness here because all of a sudden every sanctions negotiation is quite different than if cohesion was high. As it says, some European states and EU hedge against US hybrid operations. Greenland might be an obvious case here, but there are probably other ones. And then we get to the bottom left, so low alliance cohesion and a global war or regional wars combining sufficiently. And here we see Europe and the US fighting primarily in their own theaters. Some coordination would be likely, this transactional idea. But fundamentally, it would not be as expected. And trust between the different theaters, that is intelligence sharing, material, industrial activity, would all be lower. Yeah, so that's, we can talk about it more. I'll say a few words now that you've seen the global scenarios. As I said, the last ones, or the ones these are based on, were created 2022, 2023. So one of the decisions I made when I started was that we're going to redo these. The way we're going to redo them is a little different than before, but fundamentally, we're going to have 4 modules. Each module involves a trip, which I'll show in the next slide, and workshops. Here you can see kind of the different thematic topics that will be covered. And this is being done as a multi-client project. We have large, but then also smaller, medium-sized, including some family-owned businesses that have lots of global clients as part of this. So really it's about, as you'll see in the next slide, where we have the different events, fact-finding missions, and then workshops to go through what we've learned and develop the scenarios. It's really about the participant companies increasing their geopolitical knowledge and know-how and creating something of a common language within the board or the management team about how to talk about futures and scenarios, rather than us just saying, great, you wanted us to come here for 2 hours or 4 hours, now we'll give you the scenarios, which is probably useful, but this is an entirely different, deeper way of actually saying, no, now we can really think about scenarios within our business context in a more thorough way. Yeah, and I think with that, I will say thank you. As we agreed, I would try to keep myself to about 20 minutes, and I think I managed that. So, Mickey, take it away.
This is so interesting. Certainly, we can keep on sort of dwelling on these different parts of action. And if you actually put the Polycrisis quadrant back on, I could ask a couple of questions there. And it's interesting that you start your global scenario update process from the US. And I would so love to be the fly on the ceiling when you go to Washington, D.C., to have that 4 days there to develop the scenarios around the US. And on that, if you show this sort of, this one. Now, typically when we do scenario analysis, sometimes I like to ask, is the sort of worst case scenario bad enough? You know, that where do we draw the lines? Are we looking at all the possible options of course of development? And here you sort of in this particular sort of outline, you restrict Europe and US fighting their separate wars. But as we gotten the indications that we might be in a direct confrontation in economic war, and perhaps even in a military conflict with US. I think that would be the worst possible scenario, naturally.
Yes. I mean, I have a few reflections. If anyone's wondering why climate change was left out of this, it's because it will impact all of these. Yes, some of these situations will make it much worse because there's going to be not even mitigation about it, but it impacts all of them. So it's viewed in scenario making as something that must be considered in all of them, but doesn't necessarily change based on the drivers. You are correct in that it is possible to imagine even a worse thing. And here it's a question of um, kind of how much time and effort someone has. So, for instance, a client of ours has, and what they want to focus on. So something like this covers many likelihoods they very reasonably should be preparing for.
Yeah.
And then you could say how much time and effort, how many people, resources should they do? Should they already think of widely different supply chains or not? Then if they have time, I'm more than happy to say, okay, now think about a very, very different world. And it could go in both directions. I remind people that before World War I, it would be quite reasonable for Germany to have thought England and France have been enemies for centuries. There's no way they're going to be allied over, parts of Europe. At the end of World War II, there were literally officers who had fought on the kind of allied French, UK, US side, and then German officers who had fought as part of the Nazi machinery when West Germany joined NATO in 1955, who were serving next to each other. So these changes can occur relatively quickly. And to get back to the main point, then it just depends on how much kind of time the company has. Should I mention it in a few anecdotes like this and say, this is not inconceivable? Or would you like to spend an hour really digging into this?
No, certainly. And I do agree that we should explore the whole sort of space of possibilities, but keep it on the lines of plausibility in a sense for practical reasons, but certainly, spend a little time also on those very sort of shocking scenarios, as we've seen already quite shocking developments in the recent years. So nothing should come as a surprise. But I do understand, and we also think that we should look at the different shades of gray and look at the sort of course of development towards the very bad, because on that way you need to activate certain preparedness actions already. And for preparedness reasons, this kind of framework seems to be very reasonable and smart. One thing
I'll jump in. I mean, in a way, it's not an original thought, but it is not inconceivable over the period of years. I'm not saying today, this month, or next year, to see a much broader conflict where, in fact, Europe and Russia are fighting on the same side. But here comes the question of doing it from a thinking perspective. This is an interesting thing, versus then companies needing to today make decisions about where would they might, do they want to start a production plant in America? What is our supply chains? And that's why often these plausible but less likely get kind of narrowed out, other than on this is possible, but let's focus on these quadrants of the scenario. There are a few examples, which I obviously can't name, in Nordic West Office history where ignoring one of these quadrants entirely probably cost the company a lot of money. Let's put it this way.
Yeah, exactly. Well, also coming back to the sort of a primary driver effect of US politics and Trump in particular on the world politics, and you're starting the journey from Washington, D.C. We've also put together frameworks where we could assess and analyze the main indicators of the US sort of internal situation worsening to a situation where the institutions don't anymore hold the democratic fabric of the country, and there would be sort of regional polarization and political violence escalating, which we've been seeing, but to another level, meaning that there would be an internal strife in the US. And if I can reflect a bit about those drivers, I want your take on some of them, because you're pretty much a US policy expert in a sense as well. And then we can go to analyzing, what would be the relevance of that kind of scenario playing out, both from the business perspective of companies working inside and perhaps outside US, but having the global impact on the economy more widely, and how we've been approaching how to merge that with traditional risk management sort of methods. How do we merge scenario and risk management methods? But let me share one sort of view first. So we've done the sort of fracturing republic scenario on the US on a very lightly basis, but looking at some of the indicators that we would see fully realized if that scenario would happen. So meaning that there would be complete evidence on these indicators that we see politically motivated killings, militia groups openly threatening elected officials, sort of taking more politically violence. So the stance, political rallies require military-grade security, sort of the situation tensing up in the security sense more. Then the states refusing to certify the federal elections, and certain the political parties ignoring the midterm election results, which is an interesting indicator on the way to Trump's end of term. And then the big question is that will Trump give up power in a peaceful manner, which I don't personally believe anymore at this stage, that it's more likely that he won't give up power. But of course, the question is that if there is some sort of succession plan within the Republican Party, or if he will be removed by the Republicans before or not. But what will happen is major driver of the internal and external policy stance of US. But then, the Supreme Court decisions are ignored. We are now seeing the issue with the tariffs and so on. Actually, this evidence that we've been gathering is not updated on the Supreme Court decisions right now because it's been so recent. But we did a sort of AI-supported analysis on these drivers, which is not complete or necessarily even too reliable, and doesn't take into account the sort of historical contextual development and so on, but gives you an idea where we were 3 years ago in relation today on these indicators. And we are seeing a gradual but steady increase of evidence on all of these indicators pretty much. We are not yet in the fully realized scenario, but we are dangerously close. And Trump is truly playing with fire, both with international politics, but certainly also with internal politics. Would like to get your sort of a view on these indicators here, and where you see that the evidence is on the point on this, or do you sort of disagree with some of these indicators as of today?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think they are good. Having seen the list before and benefited from this work of yours, it's well, I'll start with the Supreme Court because it points to the uniqueness of the situation in a way. The Supreme Court decisions are ignored. Certainly, every other court level's decisions have been ignored. This we know factually. The administration has gone to great lengths, especially regarding immigration, but also some other ways to, I mean, as normal people would say, lie to the judges, and the judges have pushed back on this. What we see in the Supreme Court, and it'll be interesting to see when it's updated from the other week's decision is clearly the Trump administration realizes that they cannot just blanket ignore this, but de facto they're trying to get around it. So depending on how you like to think of something being ignored, they are certainly for now following the letter of the Supreme Court's decision, but probably not really the spirit of the decision. And so is that ignoring it? If you look at, rise of politically motivated killings, quite obviously, and we're not just talking about of high profile cases, but obviously presidential, or congressional or other attempts and successes, but then just broadly in society, where clearly politics and partisan politics are more and more involved, you see evidence of. Political rallies requiring military-grade security. This will probably only increase. The price of drones and the massively expanded expertise of people who know what to do with armed drones. You don't even have to go to, veterans, Ukrainian veterans or something, but just go to Mexico. And the use of these kind of drones by cartels is deeply sophisticated. So it would frankly be a surprise to me if we don't see a continuous creep to requirements in terms of having, as it says, military grade security at political rallies, just because of this one technological development.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And certainly as a background with as conflict analysis basically and peace mediation myself, I've seen in many countries the internal political situation worsening when the sort of horizontal and vertical violence converge. So, which is not taken into consideration in these indicators too much, but the grassroots level violence typically sparks then the overreaction of the vertical violence, so meaning the state or the federal authorities overreacting to, for example, the Stop the Steal movement or MAGA movement and Antifa level, so the mass demonstrations where there would be another round of violence intensifying to new levels, maybe around elections or after any trigger event that might happen with ICE or so. So these are sometimes sort of, if not sort of inevitable developments, but escalation typically takes quite sudden turns to worse, and then with few bad policy decisions it only worsens, and we go over a certain limit that even Trump can do, and then the question is, how does the Republican Party and the other sort of political, or Democrats and the other political forces in the US react to that kind of possible events. But yeah, I know that Trump is good in sort of somewhat alleviating the situation the very last moment. With Greenland, everybody's waiting what he will be saying, and then now we have a coffee break, as you put it, in terms of Greenland, as he said that I won't invade militarily, but then he's already bringing that kind of narratives up in some other discourses and so on. So he's showing also action behind his rhetorics, and now everybody's waiting what will happen with Iran and Cuba. You said that you'd be waiting that there could be a crash this week, but no, doesn't seem likely. But could you give, as political analysts and independent thinkers as we are, and I've been unindependent working with the government for almost 10 years, and also with private diplomacy organization, and those times I couldn't say things that I now can as an independent actor. Of course, we try to advise corporations to be in touch with reality, basically, and then being prepared with those. And we can then have political restrictions, what we can or cannot say, in a sense, if it seems plausible. So what is your take? How likely it is that Trump won't give up power peacefully?
Certainly, and now we've seen it intensified with the midterms, but certainly the large big lies have been set in motion already years ago. I mean, the big lie of 2022 being stolen, and it's becoming kind of a litmus test of how loyal are you to the regime or the leader, not to the constitution or even the political party. So we've seen this for some while. It seems beyond clear that there are many elements in the Republican Party where they're behaving as if there is no tomorrow, that as if there is not going to be a situation where there's a democratically controlled Congress and a Democratic president in 3 years. Making decisions, breaking parts of the system that suggest this idea of, I don't have to worry about ever being sued because the system's not going to do that. That is a very worrying way to see things. Then you can point to individual instances such as this Voting Save Act, which is not going to directly disenfranchise 60 to 70 million Americans, but is likely or is aimed at disenfranchising easily way more traditionally Democratic than traditionally Republican voters due to its requirements, largely minorities and women. You might say, well, this has been done before. Yes, in fact, you have a whole host of historic movements and actions done at a state and federal level to try to gain electoral advantage. The way it is being done now and the preparations being in place to try to either ignore or manipulate the results in a way that we can see, that is genuinely unique. I think it is fair to say that. I have no idea what Trump thinks. Does he think he's actually going to live to be 100 or 150, as Putin and Xi were speculating last year? Or is there a plan already of who would take over? Is it the vice president? Is it someone from Trump's family? Is there someone actually who thinks that the U.S. citizenry is going to accept kind of a family leadership system like in North Korea? I don't know what they're thinking, but certainly the preparations in place for questioning, challenging, and then not following through on things that generally we would have seen in U.S. elections, those processes have certainly been started, yes.
Guys, I'm sorry to interrupt. I mean, really interesting thoughts there, but we have one question from the audience. Cool. So I will just read it out loud. Do you think the relationships between US and China have a realistic chance of cooperation, or will it be a conflict?
Okay, so both of us, do you want to start or should I start?
Please do.
Yes, there's a whole set of literature that says that when there's a rising power, there's inevitably going to be conflict, whether or not it's Athens, Sparta, the UK or Britain, the British Empire, and the US were probably the one historical example where this handoff for various cultural reasons went more smoothly. So there's a whole set of literature saying this is unavoidable. Many of the examples are from an era prior to nuclear weapons, and especially prior to mutual assured destruction. China it is probably the main purpose of its massively accelerated nuclear weapons expansion program is to achieve parity with the United States. Some say, oh, it's because then they can threaten the United States and can take Taiwan easily or something. I think there's a much bigger game here. This, to me, does suggest that there's an effort to de-risk, manage, compete, maybe on the margins of cooperation when it's necessary. For instance, both countries have clearly reminded Russia not to use nuclear weapons in or around Ukraine. Quite clearly, both have said this. So in that way, I can see some cooperation. Superpowers have, even in the nuclear age, been exceptionally good at limiting conflicts when it's in their interest. And so it is possible there is going to be a military conflict over something like Taiwan, or something will escalate in the South China Sea, or so on. Much more likely, I see the conflict being economic, cyber, information influence, and maybe with a limited conflict over Taiwan, rather than them deciding now is a good time to have World War III.
Absolutely. I'm happy with that unhappy answer, but certainly one thing that we should always consider is that these scenarios are done for preparedness, and we are not doing this just for the sake of discussion. Of course, it's good to be aware of the possible futures in order to take that into account in normal planning. But if I can share some ways how you can sort of merge these scenarios in your practical planning, and what we've done also together with NWO, is that we can, firstly, if I show some models, we have always some more optimistic or pessimistic scenarios which are driven by certain drivers, and the reality is a combination of good and bad scenarios typically. So we are not only looking at certain indicators, and when we should be looking at the sort of cross-sectoral and cross scenario independent actions and monitoring topics, and also be looking at the positive side of scenarios. Even some crises might have huge opportunities for certain cooperation. So, and even in the case of the internal situation worsening in the US, it hardly escalates to a level that the European companies wouldn't be able to operate in the US markets. More likely that there would be a trade war between US and Europe, but from the internal instability perspective. But you can still reflect, for example, that if this kind of a scenario of US fracturing republic would actually eventuate, how would your current risk profile react to that scenario? So this is an example of enterprise risk management matrix of a company, having an impact on likelihood matrix and strategic risk, operational, financial, and so on, mapped out, where you would see somewhat likely moderate risks in the majority. But when you activate a scenario like the fracturing republic in the US, having, for example, manufacturing sites in the US, markets in the US, technology providers, strategic partners, and so on, what would be the risk, for example, strategic risk that would amplify? And we can see that there are some quite low risks, global trade issues for sure, impossible to supply possibly goods in and out of US, changes in customer behavior, perhaps, strategic partnerships having to renew, and so on. So this is one way to think how these scenarios would amplify our existing risks. And then you have a question, what other risks they would, and opportunities the scenarios would bring with them that we have not yet mapped. And there we can use, brainstorming of the implications of the global scenarios, for example, that Charlie just showed in the beginning of this webinar, thinking about the implications, for example, if we would be in the sleepwalking mode, what would happen to the financial system, the currency fragmentation, perhaps India becoming perhaps a real cooperation focus in Europe, and so bigger, wider implications perhaps on this scenario. And then we could go into the impact assessment. Is this credible? It's hard to say the probability of these scenarios as there's so many drivers and assumptions, but is this credible or not? We can have that discussion. What would be the level of preparedness this year? What is the impact on strategy? What kind of impact it has? And then sort of compiling comments how to revise the strategy, how to perhaps diversify the value chains and production lines and so on, gives us a strategic overview of that scenario, realizing fully, which would then inform which scenarios we are prepared, which would have the overall biggest impact or impact on strategy and so on. And we can have a very concrete look at where we have sort of our biggest impacts on what particular impact category, how should we be prepared about them when we engage the C-suite and the operational management of the organization, looking at each crisis. After an inspiring briefing from Charlie on these scenarios contextualized for your company, then we really can have a deep dive on how to prepare for these scenarios. And we can do AI summaries and key action points in a matter of minutes from the compilation of the comments from the participants of the organization, and then of course reviewing them together and creating a high-level roadmap for preparedness. So this is pretty much summarizing the approaches that we've taken to scenario analysis. Be quite concise, but exhaustive enough so that you can capture the different worldly causes of development, but then go quite directly into the implication impact assessment by contextualizing those scenarios for your business, for your industry, and for your organization. But just wanted to give this as a sort of final remark on how we can capture these scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. You mentioned opportunities, and this is obviously, I'm thinking of literally every single workshop we've done now with management teams or boards, they've wanted to focus on these things because they realize that there needs to be something proactive you can do. Even if you then mentally prepare for, I'll just give one example. Do I think it's likely to happen very soon that China tries to militarily take Taiwan? No. Do I think everyone should have spent a little while thinking about it, going through with it, Inclus or something, to say, how would this impact if they did? Yeah, absolutely. I'll say first, thank you for everyone to follow here. And if you're interested, we have a few slots left in this whole rewriting the global scenarios. We call it a trip because you see it's physical trips, but also probably a mental trip. Write to us. I think we have a first line of large and medium companies with us there, but write to us if you're interested.
Truly, and Nirmeli, if you want to say the last words.
Yeah, thanks, gentlemen, for a very insightful, interesting discussion. Thanks, Charlie, and thanks, of course, all of our audience. Just a little piece of ads from our side as well. You can, if you're interested in using Inclus in the context of being prepared, please follow the QR code and find out some more information. And our next webinar will be held in a month's time, and there we will again focus directly on the products, and this time we will be focusing on dashboards, how to make the most of Inclus through dashboards. So welcome to join in there as well. Anyway, I think our time is up. So thank you again for your
Thank you
time.
to the audience.
Thanks, Charly,
Hey, thank you to Irma and Mikaeli for and Inclus for making this possible.
Thank you truly
Our pleasure.
for you. and it was a great journey already that you put us through, and certainly it would be interesting to join you in the wider trip. But thank you so much, and see you later.
Yep. Cheers. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.